afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our first keynote speaker, Michèle Lamont, who is professor of sociology at Harvard University and made us the honor to accept this invitation. Michèle Lamont has an impressive list of awards. It would be impossible to list them all, but just to give you an idea, she served as president of the American Sociological Association. She chaired the Council for European Studies. She is also the recipient of John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, the Gutenberg Research Award, and the Erasmus Prize for her contributions to the social sciences in Europe and the rest of the world. She is also the recipient of honorary doctorates from 5 countries. As a cultural and comparative sociologist, Michèle Lamont is the author or co-author of a dozen of books and edited volumes and over 100 articles and chapters on a range of topics, including culture and inequality, racism and stigma, academia and knowledge, social change and successful societies, and qualitative methods. One of her most recent book publications includes the co-author book with Graciela Moraes Silva entitled Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the United States, Brazil, and Israel, published by Princeton University Press. Today, Michèle Lamont made us the honor to discuss her new book in preparation on how the new generation in the US finds and produces hope during this period and offer alternatives to neoliberal scripts of self. The title of the new book is Redefining Worth. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, despite the fact that you are finalizing this new book. Her paper today is entitled New Engines of Hope After the American Dream, Finding Recognition in the New Gilded Age. She will discuss during 1 hour, which leaves us circa 30 minutes for the discussion. And Professor Graciela Moraes Silva from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies will lead then the discussion. The participants to this webinar can write their questions in the chat, and Graciela and myself will summarize them to the keynote. Thank you very much for your attention, and I leave now the screen to Michèle Lamont.
Thank you so much for this very nice, very generous introduction. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, here we go. I must say I'm particularly pleased to be invited to talk to you today. I have Swiss ancestry. My family is from the Valais, so I always am particularly pleased when I'm asked to do something that has anything to do with Switzerland. So thank you for having me, and it's a particular pleasure to reconnect with Grazi, with whom I worked very closely for 8 years as we were working on this book, Getting Respect. And of course, you know, we worked together at Harvard as well. So Milena mentioned that I'm in the process of finishing this book. In fact, I'm hoping to turn in the full draft by the end of the week. And it's an extremely rough draft, but I've reached a point where I kind of know what the argument is, and I'm very eager to receive your feedback. So I'm not sure I'm going to speak really for a full hour, but I really look forward to your reaction. And it's a book that is very much about the contemporary moment. When I started working on it, the big question was, you know, our societies were experiencing very high level of inequality, which has now been worsened by the pandemic. So in the American context, the question is really at the time when the American dream is not a realistic hope for many young people, what are they turning toward? What are the new collective narratives that keep us going? And what kind of society do we want to live in? So it's a book about the US, but it's much more than that, to the extent that the US looms very large. As we saw, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter movement, immediately what happened in the US was also followed by massive protest in a number of countries. So the book is very much about diversity, as you will see. So I'm partly interested in your input on the implication of this book for Europe and more generally for understanding transnational social movements and currents. So actually, I gave this talk to the organizers a few months ago, but the new title of the book is What We Value, Redefining Worth in the New Gilded Age. And I acknowledge the support of these organizations in making this project possible. So the book is organized in two parts. The first part is a diagnosis, really the context of American society where this neoliberal scripts of self has become hegemonic, with the notion that we should all be oriented toward achieving professional success. The value of people is defined by the ideal self that prevails among college-educated professionals and managers. And this creates a gap, a recognition gap with all those who don't have these attributes, the working class, the unemployed. And we have heard a lot about these groups over the last few years. It has led to the growth of populism and of course, the support for Trump. So these are, the working class is experiencing a very deep recognition gap. Their dignity is not being recognized by people like us. And we need to figure out how to address this, especially given that even for the winners of the system, the professionals, there's a major mental health crisis that is particularly strong among the Gen Zs, the children who do not want to follow in the path of their parents. So the question then is, what are the new collective myths that will, continue to propel our society when these collective myths are collapsing? And in order to understand what society these young people want, I, together with research assistant, we've interviewed a number of them, but we've also interviewed people who are creating these new myths. How is the public sphere changing? So that's the project basically draws on these two sources, which I'll provide a little more detail about in a second. So with this title of the book, What We Value, with this focus on worth, the question is really broadening our definition of cultural citizenship so that more members of the society are viewed as valuable. So we're in the process of redefining collectively what this means, and groups that had been deeply stigmatized in the past, for instance, LGBTQ, are now being revalorized. So the person you have here is a person who's been centrally involved in the show Transparent, which is a very popular show that features a middle-aged man who, after having raised his children, decides that he's queer, he wants to dress as a woman, and he embraces this identity. And Zachary Drucker, the person who has the white T-shirt, has served as a advisor on this show on Netflix. Netflix has played a very important role in promoting diversity of all kinds. And the T-shirt says, "I see you always and always." And this question of "I see you" is very much about recognition. The idea that people are embracing their identity, whatever it is, and it's an aspect of inequality that had not been very well theorized in the past. So some of the objectives that I'm pursuing in this project is very much try to theorize what recognition is about, although it's a trade book. So there's very much a limit to what I can do in terms of theorization, but I want to help the reading public understand what recognition is about beyond, the fights that are ongoing around, woke culture or cancel culture. And the other t-shirt says kindness is everything. And we'll see that kindness figures extremely centrally in how Gen Zs are understanding politics today, which is about support, emotional support, recognition. So the personal becomes political. So here I'm building on this book that I co-authored with a number of colleagues involved in this project called the Successful Societies Project. We met for actually 19 years, 3 times a year, to discuss a range of issues around the topic of successful societies, inclusion, belonging. And one of the books we produce is this one, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era. And we very much focus on aspects of resilience that are fostered by social institutions and cultural repertoire. So it's just the opposite from this concept of grit proposed by Angela Duckworth that has received a lot of attention, which is all about the individual's capacity to pull themselves by the bootstrap. And instead, we're concerned with how societies are engineering tools that allow people to develop social resilience, which is not about the individual, but it's collective. And an example is the passage of the same-sex law in the US in 32 states, which is correlated with the rapid decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ. So this is to tell us that the support from laws that tells these young people your person, who you are as a person is valid, we support you. It's something that is created through the law and that really sends them a message that they are worthy, and it has direct impact on their subjective well-being. So it's not only about individual pulling themselves by the bootstrap, it's very much about the societal choices that we make. So as I said earlier, we're drawing on interviews with Gen Zs. Actually, we are focusing on college educated students. The majority of them are middle class, half white, half people of color in the Midwest and in the Northeast. But we also did interviews with 160 what I call agents of change, which are all kinds of people who intervene in the public sphere. So that includes not only the traditional people that Habermas included in the public sphere, but we've also interviewed a lot of stand-up comics, people who work in Hollywood, people who work in philanthropy, who are all promoting redefinitions of what is a good society. And we're looking very closely at how they understand the recognition work that they produce as a dimension of transforming society. And finally, we interviewed just for a few interviews, a re-interview with people we had, African Americans we had interviewed from Getting Respect, to see how their conception of the American dream changed between 2008 and 2019. So the key concept is probably a concept you're all very familiar with, the concept of recognition, which doesn't come from Honneth, but from Hegel. But it's about, the social act by which a positive social worth of an individual is being affirmed. So it's a collective product, it's collective definition of reality, which is centered in intersubjectivity. So one of the questions is, how does this intersubjectivity becomes a reality? How does a redefinition of a group diffuses, gets formulated and diffused? So this requires, if you want to study it at the macro social level, looking at the new definitions that emerge, but also at the diffusion. The opposite is stigmatization, which is how people are qualified negatively by their weaknesses, their moral failures, their handicap. And both of them have to do with cultural membership. And the cultural membership is about how social actors understand themselves as similar and different from others. One could say also compatible and incompatible. And this concept of cultural membership is very much a collective achievement, something that members of society constantly engage with, as for instance, when we discuss whether or not we should distribute resources, orient more money toward the low-income population. All the discussion around questions of deservedness, the debate we had in the last few weeks in the US around the voting law, but also around the infrastructure, very much about who deserves what. And stigmatization, recognition, discrimination, these are all cultural processes that are contributing to the construction, the macro constructions of societies, just like democratization or capitalization, financialization. These are all concepts that are very much at the center of fundamental sociology, but I believe they have not been sufficiently, developed. And the broader objective of this book is to contribute to a sociology of recognition, as you will see in a second. This is not to say that money doesn't matter. Of course, resources are enormously important, but we cannot fully understand inequality if we don't also look at recognition. And we know that recognition deeply matters for people's lives. So think, for instance, of parents who might disapprove of their queer kids decides to kick them out of the house. Well, the kid becomes homeless. So that's a case where stigmatization leads to poverty. We know the huge literature on the impact of racism on health. We know of feeling of misrecognition that the Trump supporters had, which led to their political behavior. Of course, there's a huge literature debating this, but there's certainly enough evidence to say that, yes, misrecognition, lack of dignity has a lot of political consequence. And the poor can experience their lives in many ways. Being poor in the US is much worse than being poor in Sweden, given how deeply stigmatized the poor are in the US. So the broader theoretical objective, which I've been pursuing, but is not really part of the book, is the systematic development of sociology of recognition and stigmatization, which was part of the book Getting Respect, which was mentioned earlier. And I'm building on the lecture I gave as my presidential address at the ASA, titled Addressing the Recognition Gap, as well as this my 2018 British Journal of Sociology lecture titled From Having to Being. So if you want to see some of the background, and I've written a number of papers over recent years that are all feeding this, this broader agenda of developing a sociology of recognition as part of a broader theory of cultural processes and how they contribute to inequality. So I'm putting this here simply if you want to understand more about the theoretical framework that I'm using, but I'm not going to talk about it that much. Today, I'm mostly focusing on the findings and trying to explain to you what is the phenomenon that I'm trying to get to make sense of. So this is something everyone knows by now, how rapidly neoliberalism has gained momentum, especially over the last decades. And the aspect of and that's true of the US and Europe. I didn't know that it was as popular in Europe as it turns out to be, 20 years ago, but it really has grown simultaneously on both continents. And there's many aspects of neoliberalism, that there's economic aspect, political aspect. The aspect I'm most concerned with are the scripts of self, the ideal templates about who we're supposed to be as human being that has been promoted by neoliberalism. And these elements have been associated in many ways with Trump. They have to do with self-reliance, the idea that we should fully take responsibility for ourselves. So the notion of privatization of risk and individualization, the fact that we should not be turning toward the collective to support our needs, but also that ourselves, our energy should be oriented toward competition and the accumulation of professional and socioeconomic success, and meritocracy that goes hand in hand, because meritocracy justifies the success by effort and condemns those who are not successful, not by the structural characteristics of the system, but by their laziness or lack of talent. So it's a whole set of values that we're all very, very familiar with. And we know we don't have necessarily data on how neoliberal scripts of self has diffused over the last recent years, But there's a paper that traces very carefully the growing popularity of meritocracy. And we know that it has grown enormously over the last decades. This is data for France, Germany, the UK, and the US. And you can see it's increasing in most of the countries, and particularly in the US. So it's become such a dominant value that people are not even aware anymore that it is one framework to understand the self among many others. And they think it's the only one, and it's the only real one. So it has increased in all but 5 of the 23 countries that this author, Jonathan Misch, looked at. So one of the problem with this American dream is people continue to believe in it, even if we know very much now that it has become less and less possible. People are less likely to achieve upward mobility now than they were 50 years ago. So they hang on to this myth, even if it is proven not realistic, at the same time as the definition of the American dream has become increasingly muddled. No one knows really what it means anymore. People will define it as having a good family. So it has become very, vague, but it's also a symbol of cultural citizenship. And then you have in other countries the parallel. The Chinese talk about the Chinese dream. So it's not only, it has to do with collective identity, not only in the US, but in some other countries as well. France as republicanism, which is a standing for it has, of course, different characteristic, but it's a collective image of what the community stands for that also is not based on facts. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this, but we could later. But there's something very pernicious about the American dream, which is this polarization of opportunities that we talked about, with the style of life of the upper middle class really becoming increasingly hegemonic, at the same time as those who don't meet the barriers, the basic criteria of success, becoming increasingly stigmatized and blamed for their lack of success. So a true bifurcation, which goes hand in hand with the diffusion of many recognition movements that have gained momentum over the last few years, whether Occupy's, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and MAGA, which is the right-wing equivalent to some of these movements, but all of them having to do with recognition. At the same time, what we know is that in the media, the upper middle class is presented as a model for everyone. So a study by Botch has shown detailed content analysis of a lot of primetime domestic situation from 1948 to 2016, shows that the vast majority of the characters presented in those shows are upper middle class, middle class. The working class is very rarely present, and when it is presented as incompetent, immature, ignorant. So think about The Simpsons, for instance, as a good illustration of this. Only their children are competent. So the working class never sees a positive representation of itself. So this situation is creates a major mental health crisis, as I've mentioned earlier. And this has to do with both depression and anxiety about success. Money and work are cited as the most common reason for stress among American adults. And that's partly present in the non-Hispanic whites, the so-called winners of the system at the same time. As they should be prospering, they're not very happy. And you've all heard probably about helicopter parents and many dysfunctions that are associated with this overemphasis on success. So the second part of the book, which is really most of the book, is about the story of cultural production and diffusion, which has to do with what are the cultural alternatives to this American dream. Where are the alternatives coming from? And how are they produced? Are they promoting a more pluralistic definition of worth? If the American dream, which is a dimensional, way of ranking people, a pecking order that is based on one dimension, social and professional success, does not work. How widely spread is the desire to have a society that is based on more pluralistic criteria of worth? How much are people embracing what I call everyday cosmopolitanism, the idea that we're all valuable as people? And how do the groups that have been stigmatized, for instance, people with HIV/AIDS, have become destigmatized? From studies that focus on these questions, we can try to understand how we're in the process and whether we're in the process of moving toward a society where there's a broadened definition of cultural citizenship. So, of course, one of the concepts that is central here is the notion of public sphere. So we have the traditional definition of Habermas, based very much on the 19th century. And you have had a number of excellent reformulation of how does the public sphere works today, with the fact that the nonprofit sector has grown enormously, has become extremely professionalized. They are very actively engaged in producing new definitions of the society we should live in. The advocacy field, the social movement, has grown enormously. And of course, since 2008, we live in a world of social media that is omnipresent and that has enabled changes that we could not have imagined in 2000. So all this means that if we're going to study the diffusion of new ideas about what our society should look like, and we have to really broaden our understanding of what the public sphere is about, to bring in a lot of agents who were not part of the equation in earlier period. So one could, conceptualize the public sphere as something like this, which, Venn diagrams that connect a number of areas or institutions, areas of action. And this is the kind of model we had in mind when we started identifying people we wanted to interview for this project. So I'm going to talk to you mostly about the photographers whom I've interviewed to illustrate how we go about studying recognition. But you have actors in a number of other fields, like here you have Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates, who's played a very central role in redefining the literary canon in the US and the collective identity of African Americans. Kimberly Crenshaw, with her concept of intersection, who was very much at the center of the Black Lives Matter movement in emphasizing how women are victimized differently than men. Kamau Bell, very influential stand-up comedian who in his show United Colors of America tries to basically portray Black men as not scary. And he's married with a white woman. He's a middle-class man. He has shows that really explains what racism is about. And, we covered a number of fields. Stephen Greenhouse, a key journalist at the New York Times covering labor, at the time when you have a major movement for domestic workers, the fight for people to be paid $15 an hour has been extremely important. Climate justice, of course. And anyway, I don't have time to go through all this, but it gives you a vague idea. Heather Boucher is now on Joe Biden's Council of Economic Advisor. She's part of the people who are trying to redefine capitalism so that it is more inclusive. And there's a very important socialist renewal with Bernie Sanders, of course, being a central figure, and Cornel West and others, that has gained a lot of influence among young people. So, and of course, a lot of people in Hollywood, those who use technology. There's a new industry now to create a narrative change, huge industry. And the focus is put on transforming narratives as a way to create social change, an industry that did not exist 20 years ago, and that has really transformed a lot of things. So that's partly what I'm concerned with here in this book. So to give you an example of what I'm focusing on, I'll talk a little bit about the visual arts. I've interviewed a number of artists who are specializing in providing representations of groups that have been stigmatized. In particular, I've talked with Lyle Ashton Harris, who, like Catherine Opie, describes queer group. And when I interviewed them about what they try to do in their work, this was textbook recognition language. We're trying to provide a description of them, representation of them, that humanizes who they are as people, describes them with dignity, makes them visible. Groups that have been hidden are now being made visible, and we present them the way they would like to see themselves be represented, as opposed to being ridiculed. So the notion that we have a three-dimensional depiction of stigmatized groups that have now become omnipresent. So as I interviewed Catherine Opie, who is part of the letter community in Los Angeles, the S&M community, she says, typically people make fun of us. We're viewed as child molesters. Well, in fact, I try to represent the S&M community of Los Angeles as a family that has real intimacy, people who have real relationship with each other, who are very supportive of each other, to enable them to see themselves represented as they wish to be, represent us with love and dignity. So this is very much, you know, instead of showing the tattoos and the piercing and the markings on the body, I wanted to do a series of portraits that was incredibly noble. So giving them the dignity that she believes they deserve. Another example is Hank Willis Thomas, who's done a video that has circulated across the country, where he simply interviews a lot of Black men, where he asks them the question, what does it mean for you to be a Black man? And as you watch this video, you see 150 men answering the same question differently. And the effect is, of course, to unsettle the stereotype of Black men as dangerous, passive, etc. So as I interviewed him, he says, well, what comes out is the huge diversity. And we learned that the one thing we all have in common is the prejudgment that people place upon us. So this is work that has a kind of didactic function. And what's very interesting, you can Google question bridge and you will be able to see it yourself, and you'll see how tremendously powerful it is as those men vary. They come from different regions, they have different age, different classes, a different color, darker, lighter skin, etc. And what's really interesting with this project is that he joined forces with an organization, a philanthropy called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which is a very powerful organization with 2,600 organizations nationwide. They were behind this movement called the My Brother's Keeper that Obama was very supportive of. And this organization, like many of the other philanthropies that we studied, and many of the organizations that are central in the field of social change, is that they focus on language and narrative and storytelling as a tool for social change. So as I interviewed the leader, Sean Dove, he said, what we're trying to do is really change the narrative about Black men. Instead of us being viewed as a problem and always discussing what's wrong with them, instead we're taught, or as the face of poverty and crime, instead we focus on their aspirations. What do they contribute to society? So the notion that, you know, narratives are things that human beings produce, and it's possible to lift them up and diffuse them at a very, very wide level to create social change. So the Gates Foundation has done an enormous amount of research and invested a lot of resources in transforming how Americans understand what's the cause of poverty. And they've done experiments, they've supported experiments that show that instead of talking about, you know, the poor as people who are just encountering problems, they try to show the ways in which the poor aim to live the way everyone else does. They want to send their kids to kindergarten. They do prepare their kids to go to kindergarten. So what is being done is trying to do narrative engineering to demonstrate what is shared between various categories of human beings. So it's really engineering solidarity at the macro level. And because a lot of these philanthropies have a lot of resources, they are able to really scale up change in a very, very significant way. Now, you can be very skeptical about it, but if you add the work that so many of these powerful organizations are doing, such as, for instance, the Ford Foundation, which was behind the film Roma. I don't know if you've seen Roma, but it's about this family in Mexico that hires domestic workers. And it presents those domestic workers that are normally, you know, like wallpaper, totally invisible, their dilemmas as one of them becomes pregnant. They become very visible as human beings. And I've seen that film not knowing that it had been actually created in conversation with the Domestic Workers Alliance, which is headed by Agent Pooh, who's a very important leader of unions in the US, and funded by the Ford Foundation. With one of the sections of the Ford Foundation is precisely about using films to transform the meaning of groups. They were also behind the film The Help. So this is the kind of interventions that really trickle down or up in transforming the frames through which we perceive stigmatized groups. So one of the motto of the Ford Foundation, the director, the president of the Ford Foundation is an African-American gay man who from the very beginning decided to invest a lot in the fight against inequality. And that meant not only mobilizing economists so that more money gets redistributed, but capturing hearts and minds. So he very much had in mind engaging in narrative change as a tool for social change. And in the book, I propose that we need to think in terms of recognition chains. And here I'm drawing in on the work of actor network theory. What are the supports? Just as in Latour's book on Pasteur, he's able to show the ways in which Pasteur draws on all kinds of support to convince others that, you know, I'm missing the word, not the viruses exist. Here in this case, you have a process of construction of reality, which requires, you know, creating networks that bring together producers of narratives and organizations that can scale up the diffusion of narrative. And those things go hand in hand. And they result in, you know, social movements and transformations that have a lot of impact. So the Black Lives Matter, for instance, have been massively funded by the Ford Foundation, as well as by networks of progressive foundations that have become very important. So these things are not coming from nowhere. And the same can be said about the Me Too movement. So as I'm working on this book, I wrote several papers with graduate students who were in charge of doing some of the interviews. So I worked closely with Derek Robbie and Nicole Tourneau on a paper on stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives, where we, for instance, interviewed the guy who, the director of The Handmaid's Tale. About, you know, in what ways does The Handmaid's Tale contribute to transforming reality? And we were able to identify a number of strategies. We have 70 interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives so that we can really speak with a lot of specificity about the various strategies that they engage in to make people, to challenge stigmatization. And this is important because so much of what has been written on diversity in Hollywood concerns the ways in which people of color were not hired, were not getting prizes, women were excluded from being directors. All this is absolutely important, but not enough work has been done on the ways in which Hollywood creatives or stand-up comics are contributing to the transformation of reality. One of the people that I've interviewed is in charge of programmation for Netflix at the global level. So she's one of the people who collaborates very closely with Shonda Rhimes and Ava DuVernay. And these are women who really have made African Americans, you know, front and center of a lot of what is being produced today. So you might have heard of this show Bridgerton, which has a lot of Black people playing 18th century French nobles. And it's very anachronistic, but by simply taken for granted that they could play these roles, she makes race irrelevant. And these are the kinds of things that are really transforming or challenging the frameworks through which we perceive reality. So there's a lot of things that are happening. For instance, the Poetry Foundation, which was until recently headed by a former president of Northwestern University, was recently replaced by a much younger African-American woman. So there's a huge process of cohort replacement happening, especially since last summer, at a very large number of cultural industries. The head of the Mellon Foundation, the person who heads the committee for the Pulitzer Prize, and a number of, after Black Lives Matter last summer, a number of the most powerful leading foundations have decided to focus on social and racial justice for the next 4 years. So there's a lot of things that used to be done that won't be done anymore. And it's really a very, very important change. And this is reflected on who gets hired where, et cetera. So pay attention, because a lot of things are changing when it comes to cultural production in the American context, in academia, in public publishing, in the arts, in Hollywood, et cetera. So part of these changes also has to do with destigmatization. So one project that I've been involved in has also been to study the process by which groups become destigmatized. So we, together with other students, we produced this paper on the process by which people with HIV/AIDS became destigmatized, comparing, and here we draw on secondary analysis. Detailed books by, for instance, Steve Epstein on HIV/AIDS and Abigail Segui on obesity. And we see through Abby's book titled "What's Wrong with Fat" that the obese simply have not been destigmatized very much in the American context, whereas people living with HIV/AIDS have. So we reconstructed the conditions, the factors that contributed to these very different outcomes and across various groups. And we argued basically this is the model we came up with, where you have cultural resources in the environment that actors draw on to engage in destigmatizing actions, such as removing blame, which results in destigmatizing outcomes. So possibly one could use such a model to understand this is part of the process by which cultural membership gets to be broadened. So as I'm thinking about the broadening of cultural membership, I'm thinking about a number of processes that feed into these change. And this is a little heavy going in terms of writing a trade book, because the general public is not used to thinking about causality as a path dependent social changes that are happening in parallel. This is really hardcore, sociological theory, but I'm still hoping that we will be able to, make some headways in diffusing the notion that these aspects of reality have to be understood. And I think that currently, a number of African-American performers, such as Lizzo, are having a real impact in representations of the body. and the stigma of obesity. If you've missed this, the Grammys in 2020, it was quite remarkable, the representation of the bodies. So to conclude, I'll just say a few words about a few papers on Gen Zs that came out of the project as well, which are partly dear to my heart, in part because I teach Gen Zs and I have children who are Gen Zs. So before you psychoanalyze me, I will say, yes, I'm writing this project because I have Gen Zs. And the question is, for anyone in the room who also has Gen Zs, you will be very aware of how they are defining reality very differently than boomers do. And they are pursuing very different ideals. And inclusion is very central in how many of them understand the world. Now, this is not all Gen Zs. As I said earlier, we're looking at the college-educated people, but Gen Zs as a category is very much viewed as a progressive. So that's not all 18, the category itself is defined and culturally defined as progressive. And as we were doing the interviews, the young people we interviewed were constantly using the category. So we're studying the category not as a cohort per se, because we know there's a lot of problem with disentangling, age group, cohort, period effect, etc. But it is also a shared cultural structures that has become very influential. So we've tried to make sense of it without exaggerating about the unity of this group. We are also using secondary data to see how the working class, those who are not in college, are thinking about their reality. There's very, very little evidence on this group, unsurprisingly, like the young Trumpians, the 18 to 22-year-old who would have supported Trump. No one is studying them. So it's difficult to know. But anyway, the chapter on Gen Zs includes information on the differences. So as you can see here, these weirdo generational categories are attracting enormous amount of attention in the media. So it's not surprising that sociologists are interested in them, even if we know very well that cohort, time period, and generations are not the same. And the term has become, Gen Z has become partly salient in the context of the social movements of the last 2 years. And it's a period where, of course, these young people at the time when they were supposed to be in college, having relationship, moving out of their parents' house, were totally stuck. And it's the group that has also experienced most negative effect from COVID when we look at mental health and such. At the same time, they mobilized in a very significant way in the context of the opposition to Trump, but also the Black Lives Matter movement of last summer. And they think of boomers, my generation, I'm at the very end of the boomer generation, as people who had excellent conditions and didn't do anything, and of course destroyed the planet. The issue of climate change looms very, very large. And now they are really focusing, I agree, I argue that, and we know from surveys that some of the values that they put most emphasis on have to do with inclusion, sustainability, authenticity. So it's in many ways a negation of the American dream. And the inclusion is partly salient when it comes to a binary definition of sexuality. So as we did interviews, we found that they are very much promoting a plurality of life path, that, people instead, a couple of quotes there, instead of everyone going to church on Sunday, instead we should not be abandoning our culture. We should just, basically very much, live your passion, do what makes you happy, dedicate yourself to, so it's really a very, very different framework in terms of life ideal than what the generation that benefited from the post-war II growth embraced. And they totally reject an assimilationist model. And they think of morality as a way to, the great equalizer. We should connect to each other as human beings. And they really are, promoting a society that is less hierarchical. So, and we did 2 rounds of interviews, one in the fall of 2019 and one in the summer of 2020. So we are capable of comparing the pre-COVID interviews and the post-COVID interviews. And we see with the not post-COVID, in the middle of COVID rather, that they are really embracing communal participation. They are redefining their life goal, much more oriented toward doing things that will benefit to society at large. So the COVID crisis really led them to want to think very differently about what will motivate their lives instead of pursuing individual projects. So we argue, realizing vision for more inclusive futures oriented toward collective well-being, sense of obligation to do my part, bottom-up activism. They don't believe in institutions and national politics. And they view themselves as an activist generation that informs their personal pathways to social change. We did another paper where we looked very closely at the repertoires that they draw on to make sense of where they're going. And we argue that they draw on 4 different cultural repertoires that are part of the toolkits made available to them. So they're not rejecting the American dream and neoliberalism entirely. They embrace the notion of hard work and entrepreneurialism, that we should really take our lives in our hands and to create the world that we want to create. They also embrace the therapeutic ethos, which is all about mental health and well-being and balance and being in harmony with your emotional needs. They embrace ordinary cosmopolitanism, which has to do with inclusion. We're all equal, downplaying the hierarchies, and this Gen Z cohort narrative, which is about activism. So we did a detailed content analysis to identify what are the elements from these various repertoires that they still embrace and which one they reject. And then we argue that they find themselves at the time when they are braiding various elements that have to do with, as you can see in the last row, an expansion of the American dream. Basically, we should all aspire to whatever we want to aspire, an openness, recognition of the plurality of life path, success defined as anti-materialism, worth based on communal participation, and the celebration of diversity and communality through empathy. So we talk in the paper also, the new version that we're working on now, on how this is also biased against the working class and very much a celebration of the opportunities that the middle class has. So there's an explicit exclusion toward those who don't embrace these values, to put it simply, the Trump supporters, but also an implicit exclusion toward the working class that is more focused on making a living and less oriented towards self-actualization. So I think the society that they want to live in is one that is very different from the society that emerged from World War II, the society of my parents that was oriented toward assimilation, upward mobility, and instead they want a society that recognizes differences and that allows people to be all they can be and to engage in self-expression. So, but it's not the same really as the argument of Engelhardt, for reasons that I could explain later. So a number of research assistants have helped me with the project. Many of them are in the process of writing papers on different parts of the project. So I thank all of them, and I will stop here. Exactly, it took me an hour. And I look forward to your comments as I'm finishing this book. I'm sorry I spoke a little too long maybe, but I hope you're not totally exhausted and you still have energy left for the exchange.
Thank you so much, Michèle Lamont, for this inspiring talk. I think we will all look forward to read your new book, Redefining Worth, very soon. And now we have, as you said, 30 minutes for the discussion. Please do share your question in the chat so that we can share them with Michèle Lamont. And I leave the screen to Graziella.
Well, thank you so much, Michèle. I have a lot of comments. I'm not sure how many of them, but I would certainly write to you more later if I don't have time to go over them. But first of all, thank you. I'm always so impressed how you can mobilize so many different sources of data to tell a very complex story. On one hand, of growing inequality, stigmatization, also growing stigmatization and exhaustion somehow of neoliberal narratives on one hand. And on the other hand, possibilities of change through diversifications of meanings of worth, destigmatization, and this idea of recognition chains. So I think it's quite impressive, everything you're doing in this talk and what you're going to be doing in the book that I'm looking forward to reading. But I want to push you a little bit as the book's still in the writing. So I think some of those things, I'm sure that you have thought about them, but I would like to hear your reactions. And maybe I'm going to start with one idea that you yourself in one of the paper really argue, the idea that cultural processes are open-ended. And somehow I feel that in the talk, maybe because you're thinking about this as a book for a greater audience, you want to pass across a very optimistic message of possibilities of change. But of course, all these repertoires, all these cultural repertoires, they can be joined in different ways. So it's possible that some of them can actually be very compatible with neoliberal repertoires that can actually increase certain types of inequality. So I'm going to go through at least 3 points that I think are examples and ask you specifically how would you react. So I think the first thing that could be raised is that there's always been those alternative streets of self. So if you go back to the habits of the heart and the whole idea of expressive individualism, the hippies, there are so many examples that there's always been there. And if you think about it now, I mean, for me, the COVID crisis really, for me, really surprised how certain friends, I should say, that were very alternative, reacted in a very individualistic way. So in that sense, they were all vegans, and they thought that we should live in cooperatives and not join the economy. But when it came to taking the vaccine, they were very individualistic. And their first idea was, I'm not taking the vaccine because it harms me, without really thinking about the public health. So I think this is, and in Switzerland, there's always this very interesting political party that's called the Verts Libéraux, which is basically people who try to join the environment with a very neoliberal agenda. So I really would like to hear you more on what do you think are the institutional changes that would allow this new scripts of the self to not just be sort of merged with this and just reproduce once more those inequalities. The second point is you talked a lot about the support to the foundations and sort of this new cultural industry. So I was really curious to hear you on how do you think if there is this risk of a kind of professionalization of those moral discourses. So I can think about NGO industries. I've been asked a few times, maybe because I'm at the Graduate Institute now, to be in panels that select social projects. And I'm always very struck by how much they use the language of impact, and they use a very sort of neoliberal language. And of course, there's all the criticisms of the risks, the Pluto philanthropy, a lot of criticisms against the Gates Foundation and how we can actually work to further decline in inequality. And thinking about the cultural industry, the examples that you gave are very well-paid Netflix shows, but they actually symbolize a great inequality that is within the cultural industry. So a few are getting a lot, but there are a lot of artists that are not getting anything. And of course, the money itself can transform cultural work. So I would really like to hear you, if you heard in your interviews with cultural producers, if they talk about that and how money in a way change, and if there are criticism. When I think about Bridgerton, for example, a lot of people accuse Bridgerton of naturalizing or replaying the idea that colorblind society would be possible. So I don't know how much tension would be there. Then the Gen Z argument, which I find super interesting, but I kept thinking how much the centrality of morality doesn't have a counterforce in it. And you talked a lot about the caring, but the caring also comes with the canceling. And you kind of mentioned the culture of canceling. And I kept thinking how that culture of canceling and that morality is also, of course, class-based. So you talk about the Trump supporters, and I would imagine that there's also a correlation of those Trump supporters with a certain class background. And it's the same thing in Brazil with the Bolsonaro supporters. I read a PhD thesis recently exactly on jiu-jitsu fighters and how much they have a morality that actually it's very in opposition to middle class moralities that are very left wing and progressive, but they construct their conservative ethos along those lines. And of course, they are canceled. So the moral boundary there that's very strong in the middle class ends up excluding those people who are portrayed as ignorant. So in that sense, increasing the stigmatization instead of producing this stigmatization. My final point, because I think I already gave you a lot, and I can see already there are other questions in the chat. It's of course between how do you see this? You're talking and you are very clear that you are looking at the US, but of course there are tensions between national and transnational dynamics. And again, bringing to the green economy, we know that all the celebrations of people with the green economy and solar panels and everything in the US, it's also creating destruction in the global south through, so is there a narrative? Is there a possibility of transnational narrative in those discourses or in this Gen Z or in the cultural producers that you can find? Or is it really something that it's thinking about the US without thinking more on those transnational networks? Lots of questions, a lot of things that I would like to hear you more. Hope some of them are interesting and helpful. I'm sure you've thought about many of them, but looking forward to hearing you.
Well, actually, I have not thought about all of them, Razi. Some of these points are really, really interesting. And of course, you coming from Brazil, I know that there's the imperial dimension of North America is just extremely powerful. And I'm Canadian, for those of you who don't know. So I also have this ambivalent relationship with the United States sometimes. But as I'm thinking about the impact of Black Lives Matter globally, I mean, I think on some topics, the mobilization around social justice in the US has had very positive effect. I wrote a book on racism in France in the 90s, where, of course, there was allegedly very little racism. And I think things are moving in France at last, probably not as much as people would like, but I think when it comes to claims, recognition claims, things have improved really significantly. And that is true also of Canada with the case of Indigenous people. So the fact that really I was doing most of the interviews during the pandemic, at the time when so many people around me were really, really depressed, including many of my graduate students. So it's true that the book could probably be criticized for being Pollyannish, but at the same time, I think many people wanted to have sources of hope. And the objective of the book, I guess I have to say, yes, I have a parti pris for showing how we create the world together, and that in fact there are openings for change that are available to us. Just one example, in my department, you were student in our department 15 years ago, Grazi, one of the very few students from the Global South. Well, now we have a big diversity initiative, and we are doing a lot to give students far more control over, like, for instance, advertising RA positions instead of them just getting them through, their personal contact with professors. So I think being much more aware of the ways in which equality of opportunities can be improved. So it's not to say that, like, the green economy, yes, there's tons of things that need to be fixed, but I would certainly say that the diffusion of social movements around social justice have had a positive effect. So This one I think I can't stand for, but I'll have to think more about qualifying this. The question of the foundation, as you probably know, there's a number of books that have become published over the last year on the Pluto philanthropy. Of course, everyone is trashing this now. And one of the talks I gave praising the Ford Foundation, people told me, are you out of your mind? So I think it doesn't take away, I mean, I totally agree on, but on the other hand, I do think that Darren Walker is really an important leader when it comes to, and all these foundations, there's also very progressive foundations like Omidyar Foundation and Hewlett. These are, you know, some of them are really led by leftists, you know, and one of the daughters of the Hunt family, which is very close to, you know, very, very big Republican donors, close to the Cox brothers. She studied with Cornel West at Princeton and has mobilized a large number of basically socialist young people. So these are things that are happening. And I think that they're not receiving as much coverage as, you know, it's not because you do have a lot of foundations that are like washing money, dirty money. There's tons of this. If you look at the history of philanthropy in the US, whether, you know, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all the great 19th century, you know, the first wave of there's a wonderful book by Woody Powell, the nonprofit sector, which has a chapter on the history, which is very clear. I mean, and now we are, of course, in a new phase because the Chan Zuckerberg family foundation is also in some ways washing dirty money at the same time as they are controlling a lot of what is being said in the public's, you know, so it's two faces of Janus, if you will, but at the same time, we have to recognize the ways in which they contribute to the creation of social change. And I certainly need to say that in the book, so I'm not accused of being naive. The inequality on cultural industries, absolutely, that is very, very clear in our interviews with the stand-up comics. Women in particular, it's been very difficult to find women to be interviewed. And I was just watching, one of the great things with this project is you get to watch a lot of stand-up comics. So yesterday I was watching on HBO Max a series called Hacks. And it's a Gen Z who is helping an older woman who is in her 70s, who is a, you know, Las Vegas stand-up comic who is not doing well anymore, to try to refresh her act. And it's really about the sense of humor across generations, which is so drastically different. And the older women have had to put up with a lot of sexual harassment. And it's this Gen Z who is reacting, you know, and the topic of, you know, sexual harassment in this the comedy field is just enormously, you know, it's very, very deep. The cancel culture, what we're finding as we're coding and really going more deeply, comparing our middle class with our working class respondents, and people of color and whites, people of color are much more, I think they are much more deeply involved in the social media, which we know from surveys. Like Black Twitter is extremely active, and the idea of expressing support through the social media is very, very much part of their world. But they also express more concern about not being able to be authentically themselves, and the cancel aspect is really hitting them very, very deeply because they don't have refuge. Whereas white middle-class kids tend to deal with social change with much more distance. They're not forced to be as involved and take position publicly all the time. So they have the luxury of being more distant toward it. But we need to look more deeply into this. And I absolutely agree with you that the exclusion toward the deplorable, I mean, that's very striking to me. As much as the Gen Zs are affirming recognition for all the groups they support, they have a lot of problems seeing the condemnation of deplorable as being equally about recognition. So this, and I think it's true of many progressives, right? That the same quest for for dignity is expressed across groups. And I think, you know, it's very difficult for people to fully register this, but it's one of the challenges of the book. And finally, you made this point about your peers, your friends who are anti-vax and vegan and wanting to live in the co-ops, and at the same time are very distrustful of the vaccines and I interpret this largely as anti-expertise, a rejection of the elite that people like us with PhDs represent, and distinction, you know, an element where they have like contradictory kind of populist orientations that don't mesh with so for me, this has more to do about attitudes toward knowledge as a status symbol than it has to do with and it has to do with their politics as well. But it's yes, a real problem. But I don't know what to do about it. So a lot of people, as you know, are now studying this. It's a great topic. So I'll stop here. But thank you, Gracie. These were a really great questions, and I look forward to continuing to exchange with you.
We have also a couple of questions from the participants. I would like to try them to discuss them instead of reading them myself. So first there is Philippe Balziger. We try. If it doesn't work, I will read your question, but we try. And then Martina van Ax. Philippe Balziger,
yes.
Can you
hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for the talk. So I was especially interested by your concept of social change agents. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this concept. I find it really interesting because on the one hand, I mean, the ones you studied, right, in the cultural industries, I feel like this is really where you could probably also have an explanation for the, let's say, the way these narratives travel also abroad, right? Beyond the USA, like these like narratives that come also often from social movements and these repertoires, because these social change agents are, of course, often like people who like produce cultural products that are viewed all over the world. So I wondered how you see them with regard to social movements, actually. Do you make a link? Do you think there's some sort of insider activists, or did you like ask them about this in the interviews? And then, so that's more theoretically, and then empirically, how you selected them. Who do you see as social change agents and you don't? And also maybe it seemed to me that this is mostly about narratives, alternative narratives or repertoires on the left, right? But did you also like try to find if there's alternative narratives and repertoires and social change agents that are more like challenging from the right, or develop other discourses of recognitions from the right? This is maybe a little bit of different questions, but thank you.
Yes, that is such a good question. Well, I think it took me a long time to really clarify to myself how I conceptualize this category. I mean, I was able to identify a number of concepts that are available in the field that I draw on. So for instance, Marianne Glenn and Mike Lounsbury, who are part of the institutional logic fields in business school, have proposed a concept of cultural entrepreneur. She has studied, for instance, Martha Stewart, and how she has redefined domesticity to make, to encourage working class people who were aspiring to this culture to embrace it. So this is a concept that comes, I mean, it's really more about business models, but you have the concept of cultural broker, you have the concept of cultural elite, and these various bodies of knowledge are typically not connected to each other. People who study social movements are not looking at agents in social movements. There's a big literature on the social problems, the definition of social problems in social movements, the work of Gusfield, for instance, but typically it has not been connected to what's happening in Hollywood and or in the visual arts. So I think what I've tried to do is really for myself think about where do I see people who are producing alternatives? And this figure with the Venn diagram connected to each other, I thought, in fact, this is a total field. And so much of the work that is being, the cultural elite, Steve Brin, for instance, has a wonderful paper on the transformation of the cultural elite in the US. And when you look at this, I think these are all the people I'm studying, but he's studying them as elite members, not as people who are formulating alternative social, agendas. So that's how I selected them as I went about, first, I mean, it was really, I operated through random sampling, and, I'm searching my word. I went from one respondent to another. I'm just talking on the word that I need. With the goal of being as exhaustive as possible in, like I did a few people in religion, a few people in unions. I tried to not miss anything. And frankly, when I started the book, I thought I would do 30 interviews, and I made a big mistake in doing 170, because in fact, that's another book. In this book, I won't be able to use many people. So I ended up doing interviews for 2 books while I thought I was doing 1 book, but such is life. It's really fascinating. I think it's extremely rich, but yes. Yeah, and I did only the left. Of course, there's something equally important on the right. They have their own intellectuals, they have their own philanthropies. The book of Tom Medved on the think tanks, the parallel project needs to be done for the right, but I could not do it.
Thank you.
Okay, we have the time to take 1 or 2 more questions. There is Martina von Arx. Do you want to?
Yes, sure, I'm here.
Already mentioned it. Thank you.
Just for Philippe, I just want to say snowball sampling is the word I was looking for.
Yes, I think.
So my question is, how do you think that the individual need for recognition and an increased societal need for more solidarity and community can be brought together successfully? Because I think individual needs for recognition can differ a lot, as you said before, between the right and the left. And if everybody wants to be recognized and on their own way, how do we bring society together again?
That's a very good question. Well, I think we can ask ourselves whether individual recognition claims have to be zero-sum. I mean, why can't different types of recognition coexist? Do the white men who want to have recognition necessarily need to put down women to have a sense of their own value? Similarly, for women who, I'm thinking of Christine Looker's book on abortion, where she looks at the dynamic between women whose identity is mostly defined through motherhood and those who are very much defending, pro-life. I would say my intuition is it doesn't need to be zero-sum. And so tell me, what's your answer to this question?
I don't have an answer. I don't have one, but I also think it would be important to think about who has, like, what amount has everyone to give into society in order to not lose its own recognition, but in order to feel as a part of the bigger thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it might be Pollyannish, but I would think ideally you would have this balance which allows people to get the recognition having to do with their individual identity and life choices, the lifestyle cluster they belong to, and the social compact would be based on a kind of pluralistic, tolerant, loosely bounded, collective definition of collective identity that allows people to be what they want to be. But you know, the current literature on affective polarization, which is exploding by the day. I was just reading last week a book, a wonderful small book by Noam Gidron, where he looks at affective polarization in the US versus a number of European countries. And he finds that it is stronger in, it compares like 20 countries. It's really a very useful book. Affective polarization, which is, you know, political polarization, is strongest in countries where there's more income inequality and where there's more unemployment. So clearly, as in Marx, you know, this presumes a certain degree of economic security, which allows people to be more tolerant of others. So I think that literature certainly gives us good, you know, piste de recherche, if you will.
Thank you.
Great question.
Thank you. Next will be Marlene Sahakian. But before, somebody is asking again the name of your book, Redefining Worth, but you had a more global...
The book will be What We Value, Redefining Worth in the Second Gilded Age. But, you know, it normally, it won't be out.
And where will it be published? Can you already say?
Simon & Schuster. The name of the imprint is One Signal. She's the publisher is a woman who did the RBJ book, and she produces a lot of very progressive, interesting books by people who are younger than me, which is kind of cool.
And the recording will be on the webpage of the conference or of the Congress during the next 2 years, I guess. Yeah, something like that. But there are two more questions, one by Marlene Sahakian and then Eva Nada, if we have time as well.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's not going to work. So I have to move close to the co-host. So I wanted to jump maybe on Martina's question, because I think your cultural change agents are doing a really good job at recognition, but they're probably not doing as good a job at this idea of putting forward a narrative of solidarity or, you know, collectivity. I think that was the sense of Martina's question. But then at the end of your talk, you gave us a lot of hope with this new generation. It seems like the new generation have these ideas of worth being more embedded in some kind of communal sense of well-being. I think you used the word around well-being, I think, and a sense of togetherness. So my question was going to be, to what extent do these cultural change agents include the voices of these generations? Are these younger generations participating in these foundations, think tanks, new Netflix scripts, etc.? Are they being involved?
And maybe before you answer, we can take last question for today by Eva Nada. Go ahead, Eva.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Milena. I don't have a question, so I don't know how you got me wanting to ask a question.
You have your hand up. Sorry about that. No. You have your hand up. So sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that. Sorry for this disturbance.
Nice to hear from you.
So do you want me to address the last question there? The young people, well, first, the remark that agents of change are very articulate when it comes to recognition. Do they talk about solidarity and collectivity? That's a very good question. Like, I'm thinking about the people I cited today, like Dove, the guy in charge of the campaign for Black men, or I must say often they're mostly focused on their own group or Catherine Opie, the queer photographer. So that is something I need to think more about and see if we have coded for these questions. I think it's very interesting, you know, going from the American society, which is known as a society of pressure groups and lobbies and, you know, sub-communities. So how do they make the bridge, and do they? I think the Gen Zs indeed were very concerned with this. And are they being brought into the conversation? I mean, a lot of philanthropies are concerned with them, and of course they're being surveyed night and day. I'm sure that Netflix is totally trying to hit that market. When this person, Channing Donghae, who I interviewed, she was also involved in the film, what's the name of it? Black Panther, which was a mega success, you know, and very much oriented toward the Marvel comic. So they are, I don't know if they are mostly surveyed through marketing or they are approached as participants. We know that they are central participants to all the social movements. Scholars such as Dana Fisher, who has written books on people who have participated. She has a book called, I think, American Resistance, which is about people who participated in all the anti-Trump campaigns, including, you know, last summer's Black Lives Matter. It's just extremely, you know, it's also a generation of people who donates a lot. Many of them have used their the funds they have received from the government in response to COVID to simply donate to people who could not post bail during the Black Lives Matter movement. The philanthropy, they take it extremely seriously, and they donate extremely liberally, which is very much described as one of the characteristics of this generation. So.
Thank you very much. We are a Swiss Congress, so we have to finish on time. It's exactly 6:30. Please join me from wherever you are to thank warmly Michèle Lamont for her inspiring talk. Thank you again. I hope we will meet next time in person. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Michèle.
And see you all tomorrow at 9 with Amita Babiskar keynote. Thank you very much again, Michèle Lamont.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good end of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.